Behind the gleaming uniforms, beneath the stoic faces that never flinch, and beyond the rigid training that transforms ordinary men into living statues, beats the heart of humanity. For centuries, royal guards have stood as silent sentinels, their emotions locked away as tightly as the crown jewels they protect. They are trained to be perfect, emotionless, and unwavering in their duty. But what happens when the weight of human emotion becomes too heavy for even the strongest soldier to bear? What occurs when love, grief, fear, or overwhelming joy crashes through years of disciplined training like a tidal wave against a stone wall? This is the story of 5 royal guards who, in their most vulnerable moments, chose humanity over protocol. These are the men who discovered that some things in life are more powerful than duty, more sacred than tradition, and more important than the consequences that would follow their actions. Their stories remind us that beneath every uniform, no matter how prestigious or intimidating, lives a human soul capable of extraordinary emotion and incredible courage. These guards didn't just break protocol, they shattered it completely, choosing to follow their hearts when the world expected them to follow orders. Their decisions would cost them careers, reputations, and in some cases, everything they had worked for. But in those critical moments, they discovered something more valuable than any medal or royal appointment. They found their true selves. Prepare to witness the raw, unfiltered humanity of those sworn to serve as we explore the moments when duty met emotion, and emotion won. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell took his position at the main entrance. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulation demanded, and his rifle held at the precise angle drilled into him through countless hours of training. For 12 years he had performed this duty without a single breach of protocol. He was the model guard, silent, steadfast, and utterly professional. But today was different. Today, hidden beneath his stoic exterior, James carried a secret that threatened to tear apart everything he had built. 3 days earlier, he had received a phone call that changed his world forever. His 8-year-old daughter Emma, the light of his life, had collapsed at school and was now lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life against a rare form of leukemia. The doctors had been blunt in their assessment. Emma needed immediate treatment, and more importantly, she needed her father. The little girl who used to wait by the window for him to return from duty, who drew pictures of him in his guard uniform and who told everyone that her daddy protected the Queen, was asking for him with tears in her eyes. But James was bound by an ironclad commitment. He was on ceremonial duty during a state visit, and leaving his post was absolutely forbidden. As tourists gathered around the palace gates, snapping photos and trying to make the guards react, James stood motionless. But inside, a war was raging. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run to his daughter's side, to hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay. The military discipline that had shaped him for over a decade fought against the primal instinct of a father whose child was in danger. The morning progressed with excruciating slowness. James watched as families walked past, children laughing and playing, parents holding their little ones' hands. Each scene was like a knife twisting in his heart. He thought about Emma's last words to him before he left for duty. "Daddy, will you read me a story when you come home?" He had promised he would, not knowing it might be one of the last promises he could keep. Around midday, a small commotion broke out near the palace gates. A young girl, no more than 7 years old, had somehow slipped away from her parents and wandered too close to James's position. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes that reminded him painfully of Emma's. The child began to speak to him in broken English, her accent suggesting she was a tourist from abroad. "Mr. Soldier," she said, tugging gently at his trouser leg, "my mommy says you protect the Queen. Are you very brave?" James stared straight ahead. As protocol demanded, he could not speak, could not move, could not acknowledge the child's presence. But something in her innocent question broke through his defenses. This little girl saw him as a hero, just as Emma did. Yet here he was, unable to be the hero his own daughter needed. The child's parents quickly appeared, apologizing profusely to James as they retrieved their daughter. But the damage was done. The interaction had opened a floodgate of emotion that 12 years of training couldn't contain. James felt his hands begin to tremble, almost imperceptibly. His breathing became slightly irregular. For the first time in his career, cracks were beginning to show in his perfect facade. As the afternoon wore on, James's internal struggle intensified. He had received no updates about Emma's condition. His phone was locked away, as was required during duty. The not knowing was perhaps worse than bad news would have been. His imagination ran wild with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was she scared? Was she calling for him? The thought was too painful to complete. James forced himself to focus on his breathing, on the familiar weight of his rifle, on the routine that had anchored him for so many years. But even these reliable constants felt different now, meaningless in the face of his daughter's suffering. At 3 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to the palace gates. James recognized it immediately. It was the type of car used by hospital officials for urgent family notifications. His heart stopped as he watched a uniformed woman step out and speak briefly to the gate security. She was carrying a folder and had the serious demeanor of someone bearing important news. The woman disappeared into the palace, and James was left to wonder if the visit had anything to do with him. Minutes stretched into hours as he waited, each second feeling like an eternity. The ceremonial changing of the guard was approaching, but James barely registered the familiar routine. His entire world had narrowed to a single desperate hope that his daughter was still fighting, still breathing, still waiting for her daddy to come home. As evening approached, James noticed his commanding officer, Major Harrison, approaching his position. This was highly unusual during active duty, and James's heart began to race. The major's face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. But there was something in his eyes that made James's blood run cold. The major stopped directly in front of James and spoke in a low, measured tone that only the guard could hear. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "I need to speak with you immediately. You are to maintain your position until relieved, which will happen in exactly 5 minutes. Do you understand?" James managed a barely perceptible nod, the only movement he was permitted to make. Those 5 minutes felt like the longest of his life. Every possible scenario raced through his mind. Had Emma taken a turn for the worse? Had the doctors been unable to wait any longer for a decision about treatment? Was she asking for him? When his relief finally arrived, James moved with mechanical precision to follow the major to a private office within the palace. His legs felt like lead, his chest tight with anticipation and dread. Whatever news awaited him would either give him hope or destroy him completely. The major closed the door behind them and turned to face James with an expression that was both professional and deeply human. "Sergeant," he began, "I've received communication from St. Mary's Hospital regarding your daughter. She's stable for now, but her condition is serious. The doctors need to discuss treatment options with you immediately, and she's been asking for you constantly." James felt his knees weaken. Stable. She was stable. Beatrice did test it is pretty effective. But it wasn't the best news he could have hoped for, but it wasn't the worst either. There was still time, still hope. "The problem," Major Harrison continued, "is that you're scheduled for ceremonial duties for the next 48 hours. The state visit protocol cannot be broken, and every guard is essential to the security arrangements. I understand your situation, Sergeant, and as a father myself, I sympathize deeply. But I have to ask you to fulfill your duty." James stared at his superior officer, feeling as though he was drowning. The choice before him was impossible: abandon his daughter when she needed him most, or break an oath he had held sacred for 12 years. There was no right answer, no solution that wouldn't cost him something precious. "Sir," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, "may I have a moment to consider?" The major nodded, understanding the weight of the decision before them both. As James stood alone in that small office, the sounds of the palace continuing its normal operations around him, he closed his eyes and thought of Emma. He remembered the day she was born, how tiny and perfect she had looked in his arms. He thought of her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. He remembered every bedtime story, every scraped knee he had kissed better, every proud smile when he came home in his uniform. And then he thought of the oath he had taken, the promise to serve with honor and dedication. He thought of his fellow guards who depended on him, of the centuries of tradition he was sworn to uphold. He thought of the consequences that would surely follow if he abandoned his post during such a critical time. But as these thoughts swirled through his mind, one truth became crystal clear. Emma wasn't just his daughter, she was his heart walking around outside his body. She was the reason he served, the reason he worked so hard to be a man worthy of her love and respect. How could he protect strangers and leave the most important person in his world to face her greatest battle alone? When Major Harrison returned, James was standing at attention, but there was something different in his posture. A decision had been made. "Sir," James said, looking directly into his commanding officer's eyes, "I request immediate compassionate leave to be with my daughter. If that request is denied, I will have no choice but to abandon my post to fulfill my duty as her father." The major studied him carefully. He had known James for years, had watched him develop into one of the finest guards in the regiment. He also knew that the man standing before him had reached a point where no amount of military discipline could override the call of his heart. "Sergeant Mitchell," the major said finally, "you understand the consequences of what you're saying?" "I do, sir. But I also understand that some duties are higher than others. My daughter needs her father, and I intend to be there for her, regardless of the cost." The major was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "Let me see what I can do," he said. "Wait here." As James waited, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in days, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The guard who had never put a foot wrong, who had never questioned an order or broken the smallest rule, was prepared to sacrifice everything for love. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. David Reynolds had always believed that honor was black and white, right and wrong, with no gray areas in between. After 15 years of service in the Queen's Guard, he had built his life around unwavering principles and absolute loyalty. With Trust Teddy, his record was spotless, his reputation unquestionable, and his future in the military seemed assured. But standing in the rain outside Westminster Abbey on a cold November morning, David was about to discover that sometimes the occasion was a solemn one, the state funeral of a former prime minister, attended by dignitaries from around the world. David commanded a detail of 12 guards, each one responsible for maintaining the security and dignity of the ceremony. They had rehearsed for weeks, every movement choreographed to perfection, every contingency planned for. Nothing could go wrong. As the mourners filed into the abbey, David noticed a familiar face among the crowd of officials and family members. Margaret Welsh, the widow of the deceased prime minister, moved slowly up the steps, supported by her adult children. David had met Mrs. Welsh several times during his years of service, and had always been struck by her kindness and genuine warmth. She was the type of person who remembered the names of the guards, who asked about their families, who treated them as human beings rather than invisible fixtures. But today, Mrs. Welsh looked frail and lost. The woman who had stood beside one of Britain's most powerful leaders for 40 years now seemed overwhelmed by grief and the enormous weight of the public ceremony. David watched with concern as she stumbled slightly on the steps, saved from falling only by her son's quick reflexes. Inside the abbey, David took his position near the front, where he could observe both the ceremony and the congregation. The service began with the traditional solemnity of state occasions, but David found his attention repeatedly drawn to Mrs. Welsh. She sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Despite being surrounded by hundreds of people, she looked utterly alone. Halfway through the service, as the Archbishop delivered the eulogy, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Welsh had begun to sway slightly in her seat, her face growing pale. He recognized the signs immediately. She was about to faint. In a normal situation, David would have immediately moved to assist, but this was a state funeral. Protocol demanded that he remain at his post unless directly ordered to move. The slightest disruption could cause an international incident. David watched in growing alarm as Mrs. Welsh's condition deteriorated. Her children, seated on either side of her, were focused on the service and hadn't noticed their mother's distress. The other officials and dignitaries were likewise absorbed in the ceremony. David was the only one who could see what was happening. The captain felt his training and his humanity at war within him. Every instinct screamed at him to help, but 15 years of military discipline held him in place. He thought about the consequences of breaking formation during such a high-profile event. His career would be over, certainly. He might even face court-martial for dereliction of duty. The international media would have a field day with the story of the guard who abandoned his post. But as David watched Mrs. Teddy Welsh struggle, he remembered something that changed everything. 3 years earlier, during a garden party at Buckingham Palace, David had been on duty when his own mother had suffered a heart attack at home. Mrs. Welsh, who happened to be present at the event, had noticed his distress despite his attempts to maintain his professional composure. Without hesitation, she had quietly arranged for David to be relieved of his duties so he could rush to the hospital. "A mother needs her son," she had told him simply. "Everything else can wait." Now, as David watched this same compassionate woman, suffering alone in her moment of greatest need, he realized that some debts could only be repaid with the heart, regardless of the consequences. Mrs. Welsh's swaying became more pronounced, and David could see that she was moments away from collapse. Her son was looking straight ahead, absorbed in the Archbishop's words. Her daughter was dabbing at her own tears with a handkerchief. No one else was positioned to help. David made his decision. Moving with the smooth, controlled movements that marked his years of training, David stepped forward from his position. The movement was subtle but deliberate, designed to attract as little attention as possible, while still getting him to Mrs. Welsh's side. Several of his fellow guards noticed the breach of protocol immediately, their eyes widening in shock, but none dared to break formation themselves. David reached Mrs. Welsh just as she began to slump forward. With gentle but firm hands, he steadied her, helping her sit back in her seat properly. He leaned down slightly, speaking in the quietest whisper possible. "Mrs. Welsh, it's Captain Reynolds. You're gonna be all right. Just breathe slowly." The widow looked up at him with confused but grateful eyes. She was clearly disoriented, but David's presence seemed to anchor her. He remained by her side, one hand lightly supporting her shoulder, ready to catch her if she fell again. Mrs. Fobb, Welsh's son, finally noticed the situation and looked at David with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. David nodded slightly, indicating that he would stay until the immediate crisis passed. For several minutes, the captain remained in position, his entire military career balanced on the edge of a knife, while he helped a grieving widow through the most difficult moment of her life. Gradually, Mrs. Welsh's color returned, and her breathing steadied. She squeezed David's hand gently, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. David carefully released his support and began to step back toward his position, hoping that his brief absence hadn't been noticed by too many people. But his hope was in vain. Across the Abbey, he could see Colonel Matthews, the commanding officer for the entire ceremonial detail, watching him with an expression of barely controlled fury. The colonel's eyes promised that there would be severe consequences for this breach of protocol, state funeral or not. David returned to his position and stood at attention for the remainder of the service, but his mind was no longer on the ceremony. He thought about his family, about the military pension he would likely lose, about the career he had devoted his life to building. But every time doubt crept in, he looked at Mrs. Welsh, sitting more steadily now, her children having finally noticed her earlier distress and moved to support her. After the service concluded and the congregation began to file out, David noticed Mrs. Welsh approaching his position. She moved slowly but with purpose, her eyes fixed on him. When she reached him, she stopped and looked up into his face. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice soft but clear enough for others to hear, "thank you for your kindness. Your actions today honor not only your uniform, but the very best of human decency." David remained at attention, unable to respond verbally, but Mrs. Welsh seemed to understand. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small card, pressing it into his hand. "When this is all over," she whispered, "please call me. There are things we need to discuss." Welsh walked away, supported by her children. David felt a mixture of pride and dread. He had done the right thing. He was certain of that, but the cost was yet to be determined. The ride back to headquarters was silent, but David could feel the weight of his fellow guards' stares. Some looked at him with admiration, others with concern, and a few with the kind of distance that suggested they wanted nothing to do with a soldier who had broken the sacred trust of military discipline. Colonel Matthews was waiting when they arrived. His face was a mask of controlled anger, and David knew that the reckoning had come. "Captain Reynolds," the colonel said, his voice dangerously quiet, "my office." Now, David followed his superior into the small, sterile room that had seen the end of many military careers. The colonel closed the door and turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea," the colonel began, "what you've done? Do you understand the magnitude of your breach of protocol? This was a state funeral, Captain. The eyes of the world were watching, and you decided to play Good Samaritan." David stood at attention, staring straight ahead. "Yes, sir. I understand the seriousness of my actions. Do you? Do you really? Because I'm not sure you grasp the full implications." "The media was there, Captain. There are photographs of you out of position, helping a member of the congregation. The very foundation of our ceremonial duties is that we remain impartial, invisible, and absolutely professional at all times." The colonel paced behind his desk, his anger building with each word. "You've compromised the integrity of the entire regiment. You've shown the world that the Queen's Guard can be distracted from their duties by personal feelings. What happens the next time one of our men decides that his emotions are more important than his orders?" David remained silent, knowing that nothing he could say would make the situation better. The colonel was right about the seriousness of the breach, but David couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. "I could court-martial you," the colonel continued. "I could end your career with a single signature. 15 years of exemplary service gone in an instant. Is that what you want, Captain?" Finally, David spoke. "Sir, I acted according to my conscience. Mrs. Welsh was in medical distress, and no one else was in a position to help. I chose compassion over protocol, and I would make the same choice again." The colonel stopped pacing and stared at David in disbelief. "You would make the same choice again? Even knowing the consequences?" "Yes, sir. Some duties are higher than military protocol." The silence that followed was deafening. David had essentially signed his own military death warrant with those words. No officer could allow such insubordination to go unpunished, regardless of the circumstances. But before the colonel could respond, his telephone rang. He answered it with a curt "Matthews." Then his expression began to change as he listened. David could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was clear that the caller was someone of considerable importance. "Yes, ma'am," the colonel said. "I understand." "Yes, ma'am? He's here now." "Of course, ma'am. Right away." The colonel hung up the phone and looked at David with an expression of complete bewilderment. "That was Mrs. Welsh," he said slowly. "She's asked to speak with you privately. Apparently, she has some influence I wasn't aware of." David felt a glimmer of hope, but tried not to let it show on his face. Whatever Mrs. Welsh had to say, it couldn't undo what he had done. The breach of protocol was a matter of public record now, and military justice was rarely swayed by civilian intervention. "You're to report to her residence tomorrow morning," the colonel continued. "Until then, You're suspended from all duties pending a full investigation. Dismissed. As David left the colonel's office, he felt the eyes of his fellow soldiers following him. Some looked at him with pity, others with respect, and a few with the kind of admiration reserved for those who choose principle over self-preservation. But David barely noticed. His mind was focused on the meeting that would determine not just his military future, but whether his moment of compassion would ultimately be seen as a heroic act or a catastrophic failure of duty. The next 24 hours would change everything. Lieutenant Michael O'Brien had never questioned the absolute nature of his loyalty to the Crown until the moment he saw his younger brother's face among the protesters gathered outside the palace gates. For 8 years, Michael had served with distinction, earning rapid promotion and the respect of his peers through unwavering dedication and flawless execution of his duties. He was known for his ability to remain completely impassive regardless of the chaos or provocation around him. But on this particular October evening, as tensions ran high during a controversial royal visit, Michael's world was about to be turned upside down. The protest had been building for days. A visiting foreign dignitary with a questionable human rights record was being hosted by the royal family, sparking outrage among various activist groups. The demonstrations had remained peaceful so far, but the crowd had grown larger and more vocal with each passing hour. Michael and his unit were positioned along the palace perimeter, tasked with maintaining order and ensuring the safety of both the protesters and the royal family inside. As the evening progressed, Michael noticed the crowd's mood shifting from organized protest to something more dangerous. What had started as chanted slogans and waved banners was evolving into pushing, shoving, and increasingly aggressive confrontations with the police barriers. Michael could see riot officers moving into position, their shields and helmets reflecting the harsh glare of the security lights. It was then, scanning the crowd for potential threats, that Michael's blood ran cold. There, in the front row of protesters, stood his 22-year-old brother Danny, the young man who had looked up to Michael his entire life, who had proudly told everyone that his big brother was a Queen's Guard, was now among those demanding justice against the very institution Michael had sworn to protect. Danny held a sign reading, "No welcome for war criminals," and was chanting along with the crowd, his face flushed with passion and conviction. Michael had known about his brother's involvement in various political causes. They had argued about it during family dinners, but seeing him here, in direct opposition to everything Michael represented, created a crisis that went beyond politics. The situation escalated rapidly when a group of more militant protesters began pushing against the police barriers. The crowd surged forward, and Michael watched in horror as Danny was caught in the middle of the chaos. His younger brother, who had never been in any serious trouble in his life, was suddenly part of what was becoming a riot. Michael's training kicked in automatically. His role was to protect the perimeter, to ensure that no one breached the palace security, and to support the police in maintaining order. He was not supposed to have any personal involvement in the crowd control operation. But as he watched, a police officer near Danny raised his baton, clearly preparing to strike at protesters who were getting too close to the barriers. The officer was Acting Sergeant Wilson, a man Michael knew by reputation as someone who used excessive force first and asked questions later. Wilson was already moving toward Danny, his baton raised, when Michael realized that his brother was completely unaware of the danger. Danny was focused on the chanting, caught up in the moment, and had no idea that he was about to become the target of police violence. Michael's mind raced through his options. He could maintain his position and watch his brother potentially get seriously injured by an overzealous police officer. He could try to signal Danny somehow, but any movement or sound from his position would be a clear breach of protocol. Or he could take action that would undoubtedly end his military career, but might save his brother from harm. As Wilson closed in on Danny, Michael made his choice. Breaking from his position with swift, purposeful steps, Michael moved toward the crowd. His fellow guards watched in shock as one of their most reliable members abandoned his post during an active security situation. Michael's sergeant shouted his name, but the lieutenant didn't pause or look back. Reaching the police line just as Wilson was about to bring his baton down on Danny's shoulder, Michael caught the officer's arm in mid-swing.